Divorce rates aren't quite at their peak. There was this huge pent-up demand in the 70s. Fatherhood was born basically because women needed help. There are many folks who will say, why should we get married? Look at the people around us who got married and everything went to shit. Hey, look what happened to our parents. Look at what happened to our friends. Educated women who are educated and capable of earning salaries still want to marry up socioeconomically.
All right, everybody, we've got another episode on the books. Welcome, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Bruce, thanks for joining us. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited about this too.
Yeah. So can you give the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, what you're all about?
Yeah, I'm a psychologist. I've been in private practice for a little over 30 years now. And more and more as I've been doing that, I started out working with families and couples and individuals, and especially lots of individuals and couples. More and more over the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, I focus more and more on couples just because I just find it incredibly inspiring. It's difficult work, but it's really inspiring work. There's something about it that just feels like a calling. It feels like, okay, I want to be helping people in those kinds of circumstances where, the stakes are high, they're in a lot of pain. If I can help them, they're in a whole lot less pain and things seem better for them and better for the world in general. So it just feels like good work to do.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat because I think that this is an ever evolving situation, especially here in America, where I think, divorce rates are at an all-time high. You're reading more and more about especially younger couples because of the dynamic of the dating world, the accessibility to multiple partners with, online dating platforms and all of that stuff. It's a we veered away a lot, I believe, in the traditional marriage in a sense, right?
Yeah.
What's been your experience as your career has evolved over the last 20, 30 years or so?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Divorce rates aren't quite at their peak because there was this huge pent-up demand in the 70s when they liberalized the divorce laws. Before that, I mean, I'm old enough to, I'm 74. I was born in the 1950s. I remember when the grounds for divorce in most states in the United States were very, very stringent. It was difficult to get a divorce in most places.
Mm-hmm.
So that changed a lot in the 70s, and so there was this big pent-up demand of people in miserable marriages who wanted out. And so that's when it tended to spike. It's stabilized over the last, I think, stabilized over the last 15, 20 years. It's a little bit under half now. It's in the low 40s percent of first marriages tend to end in divorce. But it's very common. And the interesting thing, but relevant to what you were talking about, the marriage rate has gone down. So
Mm-hmm.
lots of folks, in fact, I remember I looked this up for one of the books I wrote a few years ago. Um, the what is it? The percentage of women in this country who have babies who aren't married is now close to half. In some European countries, it's well over half. And many of those women who are having babies are in fact together with the father of the child. They're coupled, but they're not married. They're choosing not to get married. It's not like people like single moms or things like that. These are coupled people, but they are choosing not to get married. So marriage itself is kind of going way out of style for younger generations. And the age at which people do marry, the ones who do, is a lot higher than it was. So that's changed quite a bit as well.
What That's interesting that you stated that European nations have a higher um, of women with babies that are not married.
Yeah.
That surprises me because I feel like much of Europe, at least Eastern Europe, I would think that is much more traditional.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Eastern Europe, uh, the those statistics, I think it's European Union statistics.
Mm.
So it's not so much Eastern Europe, it's more Western Europe, and some of the Scandinavian countries and places
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Eastern Europe is much more traditional. Yeah, in fact, I was just on a podcast not long ago with somebody who was uh, I don't think they were in Eastern Europe, but they had a lot of connections there, and we talked about that. Oh, I know what it was. I was talking with someone. That's right. I was talking with someone who was actually Dutch, but his wife was Polish, and talking about how much more traditional it is in Poland.
Oh yeah, I could see that. So what do you think the biggest factor is in why that is nowadays, where you have a more and more people getting married much later, and b many people uh, having a family but not getting married?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is people look at their own experience. They look at the folks they know, and there are many folks who will say, "Why should we get married? Look at the people around us who got married and everything went to shit."
Hmm.
And they're not wrong. I mean, that does happen some. Getting married turns out to be a very significant thing to do, even for people who think, oh, it's just for the health insurance or whatever. Actually, it changes it's not just a legal change of status. It changes how people view you, whether you know it or
Hmm.
not. And often people are somewhat surprised by that.
Hmm.
So the people who tend to resist getting married, or the people who want to be in a couple, who want to be even in a monogamous couple, who nevertheless resist getting married, are often looking at that. They're saying, "Hey, look what happened to our parents. Look at what happened to our friends.
Hmm.
They were fine until they got married. Why should we mess up something that's working?"
Hmm.
There is a big gendered piece to that. If we're talking about heterosexual couples, it is way more often men that say that than women. And there's all kinds of good evolutionary reasons why that's true, evolutionary in terms of biology and evolutionary in terms of culture. But the women usually for women, it's often the protections of marriage more than it is for men.
Hmm.
Historically, that's true. And so, there's protections and there's restrictions, but usually women want it more than men do. But, the folks that aren't doing it are often doing it because of that. That are choosing not to get married are often choosing not to get married because it looks dangerous. It looks like it's going to screw up a good relationship.
Yeah. I mean, I can attest to that. Pretty much everybody around me is divorced. I think
Mm.
most of the people in my life uh, that had significant, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Impression on me. Most of them are divorced, right? The
Mm.
vast majority. I think that at the top of my head, I think there's only two couples to this day that are still divorced that are still important in my life,
Hmm.
which is it's wild how
Still
much.
married, you mean? Yeah,
Still married.
still married.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Still married.
Mhm.
Um, at the same time, a lot of the research is saying that women, right, are getting, uh, they're more into the workplace, right? They're more wanting to build their careers, have sustainability in their careers, make money. Whereas, 50, 60 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? Most of it was like housewives, running a home, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Do you think that shift? I've always wondered this because in my opinion, running a house with kids is a full-time job.
Oh God, yes.
It,
Yeah.
it's it's a lot of
Yeah. I'll never ask a woman who says she's a stay-at-home mom, "Do you work?" It's a ridiculous question.
yeah,
I said, "Of
right.
course you work."
Yeah,
That's not the question. Are you
yeah,
employed outside the home? Okay, yes or
yeah,
no. But do you work? No, I never asked that
yeah.
question.
It's the most
Yeah.
thankless job, the most important yet thankless job,
Yeah.
I think, in society. But more and more, you see more and more women getting into careers, and like you said, having babies later. Do you think that plays into people's divorce rates going up because now you're more focused on, your career, or the children aren't? I don't want to say they're not priority, right? But
Hmm.
you start to become self-preservation mode if
Yeah.
there's challenges in the relationship.
Oh, sure. I'm sure that's one of the factors because I think about it. I mentioned I remember the 1950s and the 1960s. I was a teenager in the 1960s. I
Hmm.
remember those changes happening. When I remember when I was in kindergarten, I'm pretty sure it was kindergarten, and some grown up would say, "What do you all want to do when you grow up, little kids?" And the boys would say, silly things like cowboy or whatever, but they would also
Hmm.
say whatever their daddies were. And the
Hmm.
girls only seemed to have three choices. They would be a mommy, they would be a teacher, or they would be a nurse. That's all they
Hmm.
could say. Maybe there were some
Hmm.
other ones, but not many. That
Hmm.
wasn't accurate then, but it was close to accurate. Those were the role models. That's what was available. So as that changed, especially starting in the 70s, big time it changed. as women actually were able, women didn't need a man anymore to support themselves. And
Yeah.
not only did they not need a man, but indeed, as the culture changed so that divorce was so much more common, women recognized, I think understandably recognized, we better not need a man because you can't count on a man to be around. Well, it's interesting what's happened over the generations, because now what I hear from folks, and you be curious if you hear this too, especially from women. I was just talking. My wife and I do a podcast together. We were just interviewed
Oh,
the
that's
other
cool.
day. Yeah, we've been doing that now for 5 years, and I will probably talk about that somewhere in this conversation.
Hmm.
Um, but we were just talking with a woman who was a young woman. I mean, young from my perspective, in her 30s, early
Hmm.
30s, I think she was, and she was talking about how educated women, women who are educated and capable of earning their own salaries and earning their own living, still want to marry up socioeconomically.
Hmm.
Again, there's all kinds of good evolutionary reason for that.
Hmm.
We got up on our hind legs, and that meant that babies had to be helpless because our pelvic structures changed. And I get pissed about that whenever I have knee or hip problems. It's like, damn it, we shouldn't have done that, but we did. So there we are. And there's all kinds of good things that came from that, I guess. But it just meant, women, that fatherhood was born basically because women needed help.
Hmm.
Other mammals, the mothers don't need much help. Typically, maybe, it depends on the species. I'm not an expert on that stuff, but most mammals give birth to young that are far less helpless than ours are. And so, given not only the relative physical helplessness, but also the sheer amount of learning that has to take place to become a functioning human being,
Hmm.
we have long childhoods, and women give birth, and they need somebody dragging me to the door of their cave for a while. So it isn't odd that women are saying, okay, if I'm gonna be attracted to a male that I might have a baby with, he better be into me and he better be capable of earning a living.
Hmm.
So I am old, as I keep saying, I'm old enough to remember. That's an old guy thing to say. I'm old enough to remember when, if a boy in high school wanted to impress a girl in high school, he had to be somebody that she would look at and say, well, this guy's, capable of earning a living. He has prospects. He's going to
Hmm.
get educated. He's going to get trained, or he's got a business he can go into, or something.
Hmm.
That is no longer true. And so what the dual thing that's happened is women are saying, where are all the guys? I can't find guys
Yeah.
who are not afraid of us. And the men are aimless. They don't know how to impress women anymore.
Yeah.
We as a group, as men, speaking for all men, a little presumptuous, we're clueless.
Hmm.
And so that's a lot of the changes that's happened since second wave feminism. And I'm not knocking second wave feminism. I'm just noting that's been associated with a lot of these changes. So it's left both men and women kind of saying, who are we and how do we manage this? It certainly plays out in a lot of the couples I work with,
Hmm.
where they don't quite know how to pull it off. The assumptions that used to be there in traditional arrangements, and I'm not saying traditional arrangements were, uniformly wonderful. They were often like oppressive and you know they were terrible for lots of people, but they also had their reasons why they survived for a long time,
Hmm.
because a lot of those issues that come up when you question that stuff weren't there.
Yeah, and I think you hear a lot, to your point, where a lot of women are saying, "Where are all the men at?" Right? They want men to provide, right?
Hmm.
But sometimes in the same breath, they'll say toxic masculinity, right?
Yes, yes.
And so that is what it is to be masculine, right? Is it's to be a provider, to be a leader, all of that stuff. But then women don't really want that. At least newer age women, if you whatever you want to call it, don't seem to want that, right? But then, like you said, kind of steers men away and don't know how to approach a woman to court them. I mean, do you
Yeah.
agree with that?
Well, I do, although one of the things I've noted over the last 30 years of private practice is that's been shifting. The conversation, I think, has been shifting. There was, yeah, the whole idea that, yeah, masculinity is the same as toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
I think that has softened. Just yesterday I think it was the New York Times, there was an article by a woman who was talking about, what is the buzzword she was quoting someone else is using, heteropessimism, so, or heterofatalism. It's this idea that these heterosexual women who want a guy to be a guy, and
Hmm.
these are, again, we're talking about educated and strong-minded women, but they're wanting a guy to be a guy and they can't find them. The guy's just chicken out, and so there is talk of that among women who are not, who aren't being written off as, oh, you're just a trad wife and you don't really want to move into your own power. These are powerful women, but they're saying, yeah, but they want powerful men too.
Hmm.
So I think that conversation is shifting some. I know it's been easier, seems to me it's been easier in talking with couples over the last 10, 15 years than it was early in my practice to to just wonder about gender stereotypes in a less doctrinaire way. But one of the studies I like to quote to people sometimes, and this is probably 15, 20 years old, but I remember reading about it. It was a study where they were looking at couples who were they're striving not to be driven by traditional gender stereotypes. So they
Hmm.
were saying, well, it's not that they were rejecting everything, but they were just going to say, we're going to be equal in these things. We're not going to assume that it's the mother who makes the doctor's appointments, and we're not going to assume that it's the father who does the outside work. We'll see where it goes.
Hmm.
So the couples that would strive, well, so they found sort of a continuum, of course. There were the couples that had very rigid gender roles. They tended not to be very happy. Often the women were pissed or depressed,
Really?
and the men were upset. Yeah, I mean rigid gender roles. It's like
Hmm.
you can't, no, you can't do that. That's women's work, or no, you can't do that. That's men's work.
Mm-mm.
That
Gotcha.
kind of stuff.
Okay.
They tended to be pretty unhappy. Maybe it was the particular, population they were looking at or whatever, but that didn't surprise me. That the sort of that sense of constriction that just the women were pissed and the men were unhappy because the women were pissed. It was that kind of
Hmm.
thing. On the other extreme, you had the people who were just absolutely going to be egalitarian. Didn't mean everything the same, but it meant they were not going to assume anything about anything if they could avoid it. And they were a lot less unhappy in the sense that they were less argumentative with each other. So you think, well, that's the way to go, right? Yeah, except for one area of their life which tended to not go very well. Can you guess what it is? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you guess the area that didn't work so well in those egalitarian couples?
I'm not sure.
Sex.
Oh.
Sex. Their sex life was blah or non-existent,
Hmm.
except for a subset of them that would say, often sort of reporting this sheepishly to the researchers, they would say, well, we play games in bed, and they're often power games. So in other words, they would introduce some power differential, not
Hmm.
always the woman, not always the man on top, so to speak, but they would introduce a power differential, and that was sexy. What they found overall, if you look at kind of the overall numbers, what the researchers found was the sweet spot wasn't 50-50, and it wasn't 100-0, in terms of gender roles. It was
Hmm.
60-40. If the men did 60% of the traditionally masculine things and the women did 60% of the traditionally feminine things, and then it was 40 the other way, that was a sweet spot because they weren't constrained so much that they were, pissing each other off. But they also, heterosexual couples, the women want the men to seem masculine and the men want the women to seem feminine. And they did. So, that kind of conversation is easier to have, it seems to me now, than it used to be. And so, I can talk about sort of those kinds of gender differences in ways that don't seem to freak people out, even if they've even if they've been to college. For a long time, it's like if you've been to certain colleges, it's like that's heresy. You can't say that. Now you can say that.
Yeah, that's also seems to be another trending topic that you see on social media a lot is where a lot of women say they always feel like they're in their masculine energy
Yeah, yeah,
because they've got to play that more masculine role. So,
yeah.
um, what do you think is the overarching with all the couples that you work with and talk through their problems? What is the probably biggest overarching subject matter that hurts relationships nowadays?
Oh, well, yeah, that unfortunately that's pretty easy. And it's kind of perennial. I don't think this has changed that much in the 30 years I practice. Infidelity. It's pretty simple.
Really?
Yeah, infidelity. Now, I say that's the biggest one that I end up working with. The biggest single one. I mean, actually, let me speak about it a little more generally because this is something, in fact, pretty much every first session I have with a couple, I kind of cover this territory.
Hmm.
Mostly I actually wrote about that in one of my books. The my first sessions are structured, but after that it's sort of like improv theater.
Mm.
It like goes where it goes, and I'm there, following the meaning and sort of providing that sort of yes and energy. It's like, wow, that's interesting. Tell me more, as opposed to no, damn it, you can't be that like that.
Hmm.
So, but the first session I do cover this particular territory because it seems to be really useful to folks. In fact, I'm working on a book now that's really expanding on this theme. It's a way of understanding the whole project of being a couple, and answer your question, like where's the problem? It's on one side of this, at least the folks that I talk to. If to be in a couple that you want to be in, I claim two sets of needs to be fulfilled. And the reason I talk about two different sets is that the skills you need for one are very different from the skills you need from the other. In fact, they're somewhat in conflict. And yet they're both needs. I'm not talking about desires. I mean things that if they're not sufficiently fulfilled, something's dying or broken. So what
Hmm.
do I call them? I call them stability and intimacy. So stability is, as the name implies, it's all about not being shaky. It's all about keeping the anxiety level relatively low. People want to be in especially if you do things like having kids, not only having kids, but giving shit about them, which is, I'll often tell people, if you just wouldn't give a shit about your kids, it'd be a lot easier, but they always seem to want to give a shit about their kids. What can I say? And they give a shit about each other too. It gets in the way, but whatever. That seems to be part of the deal and being absurd. So stability, when you do something, you have kids, you want the relationship, you want to have to not be constantly worried about is this relationship about to break up. So that's what
Hmm.
stability is. The
Hmm.
skills of stability are all about avoiding anxiety. So, if you cheat, that's incredibly destabilizing. If assuming the agreement is monogamy, which the vast majority of couples, that's still true. There are
Hmm.
obviously exceptions, but the vast majority of couples still their agreement is pretty much sexual monogamy. So if you cheat, that's hugely destabilizing. If you have some kind of substance issue and you're addicted to some substance and you're just not reliably present, either
Hmm.
physically or mentally, that's
Hmm.
a problem. If you're crazy, that's a problem. The vast majority of folks I work with aren't batshit crazy, but occasionally somebody is. And I'll
Yeah.
say that to a couple early on. It's like, well, now that I've known you for 17 minutes, and we're old buddies, I can tell neither one of you is batshit crazy, and they will laugh. But that turns out, and I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues, but that turns out to be important. They're not psychotic.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not saying the FBI is controlling signals in their brain. They're not
Mm-hmm.
nuts like that. We all have our moments, but that's they're basically not nuts. They're not crazy, and they're not evil, not stupid. I start with that. I start with those assumptions, and we all have our moments, but generally that's where I start with. So stability is all about behaving in ways that's not going to push buttons if you can avoid it, because that just makes sense. You show up when you say you're going to show up mostly, and that kind of stuff. Intimacy is a very different thing, and here I better define my terms. I mean not just sex. Intimacy, I'm referring to, really, it's the feeling of being alive. It's the feeling of that you can be who you are. You can be present and honest with yourself and
Hmm.
each other.
Hmm.
When you can do that simultaneously, those are moments of intimacy.
Hmm.
Nobody's intimate 24/7 that way, because I'm not present with myself 24/7. I get thrown
Right.
down a social media rat hole or something and I wonder what happened the last 20 minutes. But that turns out to be a need as much as stability is. And I said the chief skill for stability is avoiding anxiety. The chief skill, and this is kind of my basic, this is my brand right here. I didn't make this up, by the way, but this is my brand. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety rather than avoiding it.
Hmm.
It's to tolerate anxiety without freaking out, tolerating it rather than avoiding it. Because when people avoid it, in the interest of stability, they want to avoid it. It's not crazy to avoid it.
Hmm.
But if you do that, you're shutting down intimacy. What does it take what are those intimate moments about? When they're lovely, that's not about anxiety. When you've had great sex, I guess if I'm calling it great, that means it feels good. That's
Hmm.
not about anxiety. And when you have these lovely sharing of beautiful sunsets or whatever, I mean, that's lovely. And I wish that for everybody. But intimacy also includes things like saying something is probably going to bother your partner, like a complaint.
Hmm.
Hey, I wish you would do something different. Or like saying something about, I've had this fantasy, be it sexual or just otherwise, I've had this thought about, gee, I want us to move overseas for 6 months, and I'm worried you're going to freak out if I say that. Or I think I want to start a business, and I'm really worried, it's going to freak you out if I say that, or anything like that. And those are moments of intimacy. And people will, if they try that and it goes off the rails, they are training each other, don't do that. And so what you generally see when there's a breach of intimacy is, well, what are the symptoms of a breach of intimacy? My favorite metaphor here is if you have a seed that gets planted, starts to grow, and then somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Why would they pave a sidewalk over it? Well, for stability, right? That makes it
Hmm.
nice and stable. But that seed is not going to just sit there. It's going to try and crack the sidewalk.
Hmm.
The metaphor I like there is that the roots of that plant provided stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth.
Mm.
And so it's going to try and crack the sidewalk. And what will a couple do if intimacy is compromised? It'll try and crack the sidewalk. And
Mm.
what does that look like? Sometimes it looks like an affair, not always, but often. It's not the only reason people have affairs, but it's the big one. Sometimes it looks like they'll argue about everything and nothing except what they're really having problems with. They're too scared to talk about that, so they'll fight about who left the dish in the sink. Or, right, there's that.
Yeah.
Or it looks like somebody getting really depressed because it's deadening to be in that kind of relationship. Or it looks like somebody just blindsiding you and saying, I'm out of here without any warning, which sometimes happens. So all of those things are symptoms of lack of intimacy. So getting way back to your question, like what's the biggie? I the biggie that I see, and I realize I don't have a random sample.
It's not about
I get people who are
communication. Why
coming to a
everything you know about
therapist.
couples
The
therapy
folks who are
is
coming
wrong.
to see me are way more having intimacy problems than they're having stability problems. The lack of intimacy is what's become destabilizing. That's the problem. They're trying to crack the sidewalk.
But ultimately, what leads to a lot of those situations is a lack of communication, right?
A lack of intimacy, and the reason I'm quibbling a little on lack of communication, it so happens the title of my second book that came out a few years ago now is It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. That's
Mm.
a very snarky title, I have to say. I enjoy that title. Um, and why do I get off? It's because it's silly, right? What do I mean it's not about communication? Obviously, people come to me, and it's a substantial majority of the couples that show up in the first session are saying we need to communicate better.
Yeah.
They're not crazy. I understand what they're saying. The reason I quibble is that it's actually the vast majority of those couples I work with are actually totally fine, totally capable of communicating. The problem isn't that they're not capable of communicating. The problem is what they're communicating.
Mm.
What they're communicating is mistrust, contempt, anger, a lot of stuff, but they're communicating it very effectively. I could teach them better communication skills, and then they'd be able to insult each other all the clearer. And of course, there's plenty of folks who will do this. Plenty of therapists, plenty of books will teach you better communication skills, and then you'll not only insult each other better, but you'll also discover how incredibly awkward it is, or argue about how you're not following the communications rules.
Hmm.
Do you see? We just saw this. My wife and I just saw this the other day. You remember the Alan Alda movie, The Four Seasons? It was way back. It was probably, I'm not sure how old you are.
Vaguely.
It was probably you were a kid at the time, but it goes back a ways. But there's just recently Tina Fey, along with some other folks, remade that as
Okay.
a sort of short form series. I think an 8-part series, and they had this wonderful send up. The character she plays and her husband had gone to couples therapy, and they did this wonderful send up of the communication skills they learned in couples therapy, where
Mm.
she
Mm.
says, "I need a moment," and they go into "I need a moment" mode. They put their hands together, and she says, and he repeats back what she says, and it does them no good at all. That's why I really enjoyed that portrayal. It's like, okay, it gave them something to do while they're sitting there, trying not to yell at each other, but it really accomplished nothing.
Yeah.
So that's the interesting thing. A couple that is doing well indeed communicates well.
Hmm.
That is true. A couple that is doing well more or less follows all those rules you learn, not formally, they're not in an awkward way, but they're
Hmm.
more or less, they're not doing the stuff you're not supposed to do, right? They're not calling each other names. They're not criticizing each other's character.
Hmm.
They are in fact listening to each other, trying to make sure they understand all that stuff that you learn in the communications rules, right? That's what they're doing. The fallacy is that teaching people those rules will make them function better. No, no, they're doing those because they're functioning better.
Hmm.
Rafael Nadal is not a fabulous tennis player because he grunts when he hits the ball. He grunts when he hits the ball, probably related to something about his being a fabulous tennis player. But teaching me to grunt when I hit the ball is not going to make me rough. It's not going to turn me into Rafa.
Right.
You know, so teaching communication skills is almost never needed. The exception, there are some interesting exceptions. If somebody's on the autistic spectrum, they probably need to learn communication skills.
Sure.
That's interesting because they don't have, folks who, they used to use the term Asperger's, they don't use that anymore formally, but, folks who don't know how to read someone's emotions need to
hmm
learn that as a communication skill. It's like, look,
hmm
you see that shape in the mouth and you see what the eyes are doing and you hear that tone of voice, that means she's pissed. So you
hmm
have to learn that consciously. That's communication skills. But the vast majority of folks I work with, they're not on the spectrum. That's not their issue.
So you had mentioned earlier, I forgot the phrase already, but something anxiety.
Tolerate anxiety.
Tolerating. Thank you.
Yeah,
So when
yeah.
you say tolerating anxiety, that means that you should feel safe enough that your partner can come to you with a concern or an idea or a wish without feeling rejected.
Without feeling too rejected. That's what I
Mm,
mean by tolerating anxiety. I was just talking to a couple about that yesterday. They were finding themselves getting like super offended with each other. This is a very common scenario. They have a little child, like a 1 year old, and so the mother is freaking out because the father's letting the 1 year old like put stuff in his mouth, and she realizes she's not trying to have him be a bubble boy, but she thinks he's going too far, and he thinks she's accusing him of being a bad father
mm,
by doing that. And what they had to learn to tolerate is, well, yes, she is, but she doesn't. They're both saying of each other, "Oh my God, she's a good mother. Oh, well, he's a great father." They don't really think that, but in that moment, yes, she's accusing him of harming their child. That's an
mm,
awful thing, right? But
mhm,
she sort of is. She's not saying you're going to kill him and I have to call the authorities. She's saying you're making me uncomfortable. If
mhm,
they can tolerate the anxiety and hear that, it's like, well, she is sort of saying you're not being the father she wishes you were in that moment. But that doesn't mean you have to agree with her.
mhm.
And don't be mortally offended by that. You feel
Mhm.
like she's being wrong for overprotecting the kid, right?
Right.
It it's tolerating that stuff rather than freaking out about it. So I
Mhm.
think you're absolutely right. You need to feel safe enough. You need to feel like your partner's not going to be a complete asshole.
Yeah.
So that you can actually, when a couple learns, when a couple can tolerate it, then yeah, you go with the complaint. The other person may not like it, but at least you can get through the conversation and maybe come out feeling like, oh, wait a minute, I think I hear what you're saying.
So at the same time, you don't want to tolerate anxiety to the point where you just don't say anything, or
Right.
if something is said, you shut down and you don't give any feedback to the statement, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you're absolutely right. You can tolerate anxiety to a fault. You can
Yeah.
let yourself be abused and do
Yeah.
nothing about it.
hmm
And people will talk themselves out of it. And yeah, you need to tolerate the anxiety of knowing yourself as well. That's what
hmm
I include that in my little sort of quasi definition of intimacy, when
hmm
you're present and honest with yourself as well as each other. So it's like to recognize that sense of I don't like how this feels and do something about it, but not freak out.
hmm
And even freaking out, as I pointed out various times, even freaking out has its place. We panic for good reason. We are the
hmm
descendants of ancestors who panicked too much rather than too little. Because the
hmm
ones who panicked too little didn't become our ancestors. They got eaten before they could have offspring, right? That's called natural selection, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we are tuned to be a little too panicky rather than a little not panicky enough.
Yeah. Is there I think I already know the answer to this, but I'll ask it. Is there of the couples that you work with or the studies that you've done, genders that cheat more?
You'd think the answer to that would be, yeah, men cheat more. The statistics show men cheating more, but that's because of the limitations of the statistics, I think.
I was going to say because women are very hiding it.
Yeah, that women or won't admit to it, or I think there probably is something to the idea that married men cheat more than married women.
Mm,
who are they cheating with? Well, unmarried women, you know.
Hmm.
So I think that's probably true. For the same reasons that it's usually women that want to be married more than men. It's not necessarily the same people exactly, but the
Right.
same tendencies I think govern that. But it's one of the ways that congratulations, women, you're catching up. Because I think that used to be much more pronounced.
Yeah.
There's still whole cultures where the expectation is the guy has a lover, and the
Mm-hmm.
expectation is that the wife doesn't. And to what extent that's statistically still true, I don't know. But so yeah, men somewhat more than women, but not that much more.
So, in your opinion, what do you think is the biggest? Do you think the reason for infidelity is like on the men's side, more related to evolutionary biology, where we're always trying to spread our seed, right? Spread our seed, or is it because of a lack of a need not being fulfilled?
I tend to think it's the latter. It's a lack of a need not being fulfilled. Much more. I mean, I have met couples, not that many. Again, I don't. Before I was a psychologist, I was a statistician. I still have my statistician brain. It
Okay.
kicks in. It's like I don't have a random sample. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Of the folks who see me, it doesn't. There are very few where it feels like, oh, he's just not into monogamy. He's claiming he is, but he's not really. I don't
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of those. I did for a while. I was seeing single guys where that was the case, and they were the single guys who genuinely liked women and respected women, and they were coming to me. It was funny. It was like 4 or 5 guys in the course of a year. This particular sort of subset. It's funny how that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all saying, I keep breaking these women's hearts and I don't mean to. And I'm absolutely upfront from day one. I don't want a monogamous relationship. I'm not looking to be in but let's have fun. And these are the kind of guys that women fall for because they really do, they really focus on them. It's like they're really good guys.
Yeah.
And they're coming to see a therapist because they're genuinely distressed at the hearts they're breaking.
Yeah.
So I
Interesting.
have seen that, but not married guys. It's funny. The guys I'm referring to, I remember the first one was a guy who had been married for 25 years or something, never cheated, got divorced, and then proceeded into that pattern.
Mm.
So it wasn't, these weren't people that were, routinely cheating on their wives. But among the married folks I see, or committed couples that I see, infidelity seems to me it's much more about the context makes them vulnerable to it
Mm-hmm.
rather than that they don't give a shit and they're just going to go around spreading their seed.
Uh-huh.
And of course it's always an interesting thing when you're dealing with really any kind of betrayal, but this is the most common one that I see. When you're dealing with infidelity, it's a fine line between looking at the context and offering excuses. And early on, whoever was the one who was cheated on and is pissed as hell usually will often resist the notion of looking at the context, like what was the relationship like, what was intimacy like in the relationship, because that feels like it's just offering excuses.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
And what tends to get past that is if the person who did the cheating isn't offering excuses, first of all, is clear about no, I never would have thought in a million years I'd do this. I did it, and I wasn't crazy. I chose to do it. It was wrong, but I chose to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's look at, okay, what was happening for you that you would make that choice? And if the other partner can handle that, if the one who was cheated on can handle that without freaking out, that couple's got a shot. If they can both handle it without freaking out, they have a shot. And that's what differentiates the couples. It's the couples that have a shot from the ones that don't. And I never know, like right up front, I never know how that's going to turn out. I don't
Mm-hmm.
even bother predicting anymore because I think my predictions would be worse than chance.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think I could do it. I've been wrong so much if I tried that I don't try. But in retrospect, the ones that do well are the ones where they have, and it's funny, the word I use for that is faith. They have the faith to look at the hard stuff rather than shy away from it. They
Mm.
tolerate that anxiety. They're the ones who get through it and often get through it. Well, together or separate, they get through it better off than they were. And if
Mm-hmm.
they stay together, they're way better off than they were. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, they stay together because they're better off than they ever were. And they
Mm-hmm.
will often express, even the one cheated on will often express gratitude, not for the cheating per se, but for
Mm-hmm.
the crisis. They'll say, wow, I now see we were headed for a crisis. We didn't realize it,
Mm-hmm.
but here we are, and I'm so grateful because look how much better off we are now.
Mm. So, from your experience, what's usually the success ratio of people that in that situation that stay together?
I don't track that
Mm.
precisely because that's not how I define success.
Okay.
So, and it's funny, you think, and I'm an old statistician, I said, right? You think I would like track the numbers.
Yeah.
I don't track that because I don't define what success is, and I recognize it's interesting in couples therapy. There are three opinions about success at any given moment. Mine being the least important, I think. It's the couples that matters. But I have my opinion, and then they each have theirs, and it's not always the same. And when they've broken up, it's almost never the same. When they've broken up, often it's one of them will be thinking, wow, that's just what we needed, that therapy to clarify this and get it to the point where I could pull the plug. And the other person's feeling like, well, that sucks. We came to therapy hoping to save this, and it's not.
Mm.
And I absolutely respect both of those positions. So I don't know how to rate that. It's
Mm.
sort of success
Makes
for one
sense.
person and not for the other. I have seen couples that have stayed together where I might be thinking, boy, that wouldn't be my choice, but hey, it doesn't have to be my choice.
Yeah.
But they're thinking it's a success.
Yeah.
So I don't. That's not the metric. The metric is much more individual, and so they have to decide for themselves. Did it help or didn't it? I will say, much as I don't track the numbers, but the first question that I ask in that structured first session that I talk about,
Mhm.
I have a favorite opening question, and I identify it as such. I always say to people, "This is my favorite opening question. Here it is. How will you know if this is helping?"
Mm.
Right from the get-go, I focus them right on that. It's like, okay, you guys are deciding if this is helping. How will you know? And that changes over time, but that's the focus. And I will repeat that question as needed over the course of the work. If
Mhm.
there are occasions where I'm thinking, I'm not sure I'm helping, and I'll ask. I'll say, I'll say that. It's like, I don't know if this is helping. What do you think? And sometimes they'll convince me it is, and sometimes they won't. And then I will suggest, well, why don't you try either somebody else or something else, because I don't think I'm helping you much. Very often, I won't have to ask it because it'll be clear. They'll be focused on it and they'll be telling me.
Do you ever recommend for them to go to separate therapy sessions on their own with maybe a different therapist or something like that so they can work on their own
Yeah,
personal shortcomings?
they often do that. I don't often recommend it. It's not that I think they shouldn't do that.
Hmm.
But the reason I don't recommend it is, first of all, there's some interesting research that actually a guy named Bill Doherty, and that's a name you may have heard of. Do you ever heard of the organization Braver Angels?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a fan, and he's one of the founders of Braver Angels, and he is all about getting people talking across the political spectrum, which is
Hmm.
I find very, speaking of inspiring, I find that an inspiring thing to support. But he did some research where he showed that people in couples therapy who were also doing individual therapy were more likely to split up than if they weren't.
Really?
Yeah. And I'm not, that doesn't surprise me. And because I've done lots of individual therapy with people. It
Hmm.
doesn't surprise me because the focus of individual therapy is on the individual, obviously, and
Hmm.
the therapist is trying to elicit from the person they're working with whatever's going to help them feel better. That's not
Right.
surprising.
Yep.
And when that focus is narrowed, it's not surprising that often inadvertently, well, I say inadvertently, there are many therapists who you clearly get the sense that they're thinking if you're not happy in a couple, you should split up. Why should you
Mm-hmm.
stay in something if you're not happy?
Mm-hmm.
That's an orientation. There's lots of folks who have that orientation whether they know it or not, and that's how they, that influences how they work with people. So there's that. That's another reason why that sometimes happens. Having said that, plenty of people I work with are doing that. I don't say they shouldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is very helpful. It kind of depends on the person. I'll tell you something else that I often suggest people be cautious about. It's really common, again, very, very much gendered in one direction. It's really common for a couple to be in practice with me, and the woman is in individual therapy, and she's saying to the man, "You should be in individual therapy. What's the matter with you?"
Mm.
And like you're clearly fucked up. You need to get fixed. It tends not to go well, first of all. And as I point out to the woman, you don't need him to be in therapy. You need him to behave differently.
Mm-hmm.
How he ends up behaving differently isn't the point. Therapy's a tool. It works, it doesn't work, it's helpful. And I'm a therapist. It's like, I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just observing. Don't focus on whether or not he goes to therapy as the issue. Focus on whether the changes are happening that you need to see. That's
Mm.
what you need to see. That can happen a variety of ways, and men are characteristically different from women in lots of ways. Who knew? That's again, we're now allowed to say that.
Mm-hmm.
I say characteristically. Obviously, there's huge overlap. Not everybody's the same, et cetera, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. But it is men that tend to resist therapy. And actually, I did a video. In fact, it's going to be also a chapter in the book that I'm writing now, how to get your reluctant guy to go to therapy.
Mm.
And my whole point in that, that's sort of addressed to women trying to get a guy to go to therapy. What I say is the only way you'll have any traction with him is if you recognize that his misgivings are well founded.
Mm.
He's not going to. Most guys aren't going to tell you the reason he's not going is because he's terrified. Of course, they'll tell you the reason he's not going is because you're the one with the problem. So why don't you go? Or that's stupid. Or only crazy people go to therapy. Or any of a host of things that are basically covering up the fact that he's terrified.
Mm-hmm.
We
Especially the older generation.
Speaking as one, yes, yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah. We tend to be afraid of it. But
Mm-hmm.
again, our fear tends to be well founded because all of us have seen, and even in younger generations, people go to therapy, realize, oh, what are you in a marriage for you don't want to be in, and split up. So
Mm-hmm.
he's thinking if we go to therapy, that's what's going to happen. He's terrified of losing her. That's why he's afraid. If
Mm.
she can recognize that, he has a shot at saying, "Oh shit, at least you understand why I'm afraid," which is saying, by the way, because what she's thinking often is he doesn't care enough to go. He
Mm-hmm.
won't be bothered to go. He doesn't care enough about me. And it's really the opposite. It's like, no, he doesn't want to lose you. He's terrified of losing you. He does care
Mm-hmm.
about you. But,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't get through. When she recognizes that and can validate it somewhat, he's got a shot at saying, oh shit, but we've been having problems, haven't we? And I might lose you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, I don't want to lose you. I better go, you know?
Yeah.
Then it's possible he'll risk it. But she needs to recognize, and I as therapist recognize it's a huge risk for people to show up that way, especially for men. More for men than for women. It's a risk.
At the same time, don't you think that there is this mentality both between men and women where women always say they want their men to become vulnerable,
Yeah, yeah,
and men don't want to become vulnerable because then they don't feel or look like a man, because
right.
in their experience when they do become vulnerable they get rejected, and
Yeah,
so then they just close off and are like, you know what, I'm going to stand proud, and I'll deal with I'll deal with this on my own.
yeah, yeah. I've often noted that sometimes women will talk as if what they want is a girlfriend with a penis.
Yeah, right,
and
right,
and they're not going to get it. And this
right.
and of course it's interesting as if I pointed that out to women, and I will only point that out in a friendly context. You know what I mean? It's like
Uh-huh.
I mean in
Yeah.
a where I'm not being at all dismissive of what she wants. I'm being supportive of what she wants. And
Hmm.
she will often note that. The woman will often note that. It's like, no, I don't want that. I actually want him to be a man. I don't want him to be an asshole, but I want him to be a man.
Hmm.
So that the notion of toxic masculinity is not an empty notion. There are aspects that are awful, I mean, for the women involved.
Hmm.
And yet, yeah, there is baby and there's bathwater, or an awful lot of baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. It's like,
Hmm.
no, no, I don't want him not to be masculine. I want him not to be a jerk. Well, and in fact, you can apply that in equal opportunity because he doesn't want her to be, not to be feminine, but he wants her not to be a jerk either.
Sure.
And because both men and women are quite capable, we're all capable of being jerks quite
Yeah.
effectively in
Hmm.
perhaps different ways. And so, to the extent that, yeah, both parties want the other to be that,
Mm.
they want that polarity. The erotic charge is based on that difference.
Hmm.
And again, even gay couples have that. There's erotic
Interesting.
charge. They tend to be very different. There's the stereotypical. One of them's more butch and the other's more femme. If you're talking
Yeah.
about lesbians or
Hmm.
whatever, but there's that. But even if that's not obvious, there's always some kind of polarity like that. That is what's exciting.
Hmm. Yeah, you always hear how women want a man that can, be strong and stand their ground and defend themselves, and all of that stuff. And then I think a lot of men feel like, well, if if I am defending myself, how do I defend myself to a point where, like you said, she can tolerate the anxiety of me actually defending myself, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, and it involves defending yourself in a way, I think, as men, defending ourselves in a way that also is aware of what it's from an outside perspective of what it's like to be a woman,
Mm-hmm.
respectful of her as a woman,
Mm-hmm.
and especially with a romantic partner. That relationship isn't the same as a relationship with some other guy or some other person at work.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different, and we often aren't good at recognizing that. It's another of my favorite little metaphors they'll trot out is closed captioning. You know what closed captioning is
Yeah.
on a video, right? If you turn on the closed captioning when a couple is talking to each other,
Mm-hmm.
what I claim you should assume, and it isn't even always accurate, it doesn't matter. This is a good place to start with this assumption. Whenever she says anything to you, or whenever he says anything to her, either way, when she says something to you, assume that she's saying what she's saying, listen to what she says, respect what she says, whatever she's saying, please pass the salt, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Assume that the closed captioning, if you turn it on, would say, by the way, do you love me? Do you respect me? How are we okay right now? And your response needs to address respectfully what she's actually said at the same time in your closed captioning saying, by the way, absolutely I love you and I respect you and we're doing fine. Or maybe we're not, but I care.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about it. That
Yeah.
that closed captioning stuff is where the action is as far as the actual emotions of the relationship are concerned.
A lot of what you say reminds me a lot of what Tony Robbins teaches a lot when he does his what the hell is the name of that seminar? It's not Date with Destiny. It's the couples seminar. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it, but don't know much about it. Yeah, I think I
Yeah,
heard of
because
Tony
he's
Robbins.
basically kind of like remarketed Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
And he's labeled it more towards relationships, feeling safe, all of those things. And if you just practice those, in your relationship, then overall your relationship is going to be better. It's
Hmm.
it's very much what you're preaching here, which I
Yeah.
love. It's great. Is your wife a therapist as well?
She's not. No, she's a retired educator.
Okay.
She was the educator at our synagogue, the religious school. She was the principal there
Hmm.
for 20 some years. And then she retired. And we were, the origin of our podcast is I had a book where the publication date, and you can catch the significance of this particular date, it was leap day, February 29th, 2020. Well, guess what happened right after that? Everything shut
COVID.
down. That was
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
So we couldn't do any sort of in-person events. So I asked, and she's great on. We have great chemistry together, which people comment on all the time when they see
Hmm.
our podcast. And I asked her, "Hey, would you do a book launch with me?" So she said, "Sure." So we did a Facebook book launch, and people said, "Oh, you guys should do a podcast." So we said, "All right, that'll be fun." As you know, presumably the barrier to entry is very low.
Uh-huh.
It's not hard to start a podcast. And so we've been doing it now for 5 years, so
That's great.
a little over 5 years, and 213, 214 episodes, something like that, of
Uh-huh.
which about half of them we have guests, as you have, and the other half is just the two of us talking about whatever stuff we feel like talking about. And we have a lot of fun doing it, and we've interviewed folks from all over the place. So what she provides in it, I'll joke and say, well, yeah, I'm the therapist and she's the real person. But she has a lot of experience dealing with folks as well as
Sure.
a school principal. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how long you guys been married?
21 years. We are a second marriage,
Uh-huh.
and that's interesting too. We've learned a lot from that as well.
Sure.
And so yeah, I was in my early 50s. She was in her late 40s when we got married.
Well, that's key, right? Is learning from your past mistakes to not repeat them. And then, because, like you're a statistician, the stat is second marriage is a higher divorce rate
Yes, it is.
than the first.
I have my theories, by the way. I'll share with you if you like.
Please,
I
yes.
have my theories about why that is true. Again, this is real statistical. If you
Mm-hmm.
think about the pool of people who got married and then got divorced the first time,
Mm-hmm.
a portion of that pool are what I would claim are people like me and my wife,
Mm-hmm.
where it just didn't work out for
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of reasons. I always like to. I tell this short story of my first marriage. Both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's the short story of my first
Mm.
marriage. Yeah. Turned out she figured out she was gay. And people in our generation, it took a long time for her to figure that out. It's like, yeah,
Wow.
I was playing for the wrong team. You were two good people, but not for each other. So that was that. And my wife's story was very different. But in any case, so some proportion of the folks getting married a second time are the ones whose first marriages didn't work out, even though your marriage material, it just didn't work out.
Hmm.
Another chunk of the people who got divorced the first time probably shouldn't marry anybody.
Mm.
They're the ones who, for whatever reason, and I don't mean to be unkind or dismissive, but for whatever reason, it's a maturity thing or it's for any of a variety of reasons, they're a bad bet to marry
Hmm.
anybody, but they go ahead and marry anyway.
Mm.
They're going to get divorced again. It's not going to work. It's them. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
like that's another way of saying it is it's not you, it's me. Well, no, in those cases it's them. It's
Hmm.
like they're the problem and they're going to keep being the problem. So statistically, they will form a larger proportion of that second group because the people in the who got married the first time, who are good marriage material and found the right person, stay married.
Mm.
So that second cohort, then the people who go into second marriages are the folks who shouldn't marry anybody are overrepresented, and so it's not going to work out. So that's one way of saying it.
So then, a scenario. Let's say you just got through a divorce, right? And most people are going to get into another relationship, whether that's committed or married.
Hmm.
What would you tell someone that to do in order to be successful the next round when you had mentioned earlier a lot of times because a lot of times people they'll get divorced, they'll go to therapy to try and figure themselves out or what went wrong, right?
Yep, I've worked with a lot of them.
Right. But
Yep.
then you get what you said where when they go by themselves to that therapist, then it kind of becomes siloed and makes it about them, and maybe they might not really progress the way that they should if they were in couples. So what would be your suggestion for someone to do to be able to be successful in their next relationship?
Yeah. It's interesting. I just happened to be working on this chapter. Um, I actually back it up a little bit in time to before you break up, even if you're going to break up. What I
Mm-hmm.
advise people in general, just a very sort of loose guideline, is if you're not dealing with obvious deal breakers, by the way, obvious deal breakers are not necessarily the most painful. It's just that they're unresolvable. Somebody wants to have kids, the other absolutely doesn't want to have kids. There's no compromise possible.
Mm-hmm.
If they care enough, they're going to split up. It's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a deal breaker. Or somebody has to live on the West Coast and somebody has to live on the East Coast, and there's just no compromise possible. And sorry, but wrong person. That happens.
Yeah.
But if it's not deal breakers, my general advice, and if you're not in danger of violence, if you're not physically unsafe, get the hell out. That's
Mm-hmm.
pretty clear.
Yeah.
But if you're not physically unsafe, don't break up too soon. Now, what do I mean by too soon? It really relates to your question. Too soon means before you learn what you need to learn from this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're going to break up, you need to get a sense of what was it? What can you learn from this? Because it's teaching you a lot if you can open your mind to it. So part of that advice of what do you do to do better next time is learn what you needed to have learned,
Mm-hmm.
either by hanging in there long enough and then you realize, yeah, it isn't going to work. We'll choose to break up, but wish you well, but okay, lessons learned. Or afterward, and a lot of that is by, oddly enough, redeeming what you went through. You know what I mean by that? Because people, when they divorce, they'll often feel like, oh, those last 10 years were a total waste, or,
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had something and it meant nothing. And the process of redeeming that is often saying, no, actually, it was real. It was what it was. Turned out not to work out, but I was there and I learned from it and I grew from it. And there were good times and bad times. It's sort of processing the trauma
Mm-hmm.
aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Because, trauma is that which, when you think about it, it still freaks you out.
Yeah.
When you processed it, it's no longer having a traumatic effect. It was traumatic at the time, but when you process it, it's like, well, that sucked, but I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
I can, if I'm reminded of it, I don't freak. And to get into another relationship, you have to be ready for another relationship. You have to be able to be reminded of all this relationship stuff and not freak out.
Yeah.
Which comes back around to tolerating anxiety. Which, but my wife and I were saying, if people listening to our podcast did a drinking game, and every time I say tolerate the anxiety, they took a shot, they'd be plastered by the end of the episode. I say it a lot. It's like
Yeah.
it's my thing. It's a shtick.
Hmm. Yeah.
But it's about that. It's learning to tolerate that anxiety. So, one of the interesting things that happens, I remember this from my own experience when I said I was in my 50s when I, got together with the woman I've been married to now for 21 years. And one of the things I remember noticing was, wow, this feeling of being head over heels in love, which I was feeling big time.
Hmm.
I remembered that feeling the first time from decades before.
Mm.
The difference was I could talk about it now.
Mm.
The difference was I was a grown up.
Yeah.
I could actually talk about it. I
You
could say
mature.
that.
You're saying you matured.
I matured. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another one word for like, what do you have to be okay in the next relationship? Mature.
Hmm.
You need to have learned. That's, you need to not be freaking out over a lot of nuances and uncertainties that you can't quite control and don't quite have a handle on. That's called life.
Yeah.
And when you can be okay with that, it can be amazing. But it's also scary at times.
Hmm.
So that phenomenon of, yes, being able to feel it and still talk about it,
Hmm.
that's maturity, and that helps a lot getting into future relationships.
Do you have a hard stop or anything, or can we keep going?
No, I'm fine.
Okay,
I
great.
don't have a hard stop. Yeah.
So another question I was going to ask is, I think the origin of marriage really, the institution of marriage, from what I've read, stemmed from way back when, where tribes would join their son and their daughter together to combine resources, combine land, all of that stuff. So marriage wasn't really ever for love up until the last, maybe, what do you think, couple hundred years, but prior to that,
If
it
that,
was,
yeah.
mostly it was a transaction. It was transactional.
Hmm.
Do you think that we as humans are really meant for monogamy, long-term relationships, marriage?
That's a controversy, isn't it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I can find good arguments on both sides of that one.
Hmm.
And I like that. It's like, well, okay, I can go either way with that one. I personally like marriage. Do you know what I mean? That's my answer to that is influenced by my personal choices. Not only choices, my personal proclivities. I think I'm wired to be married. I've said that to folks. I liked being married even when I was in a bad marriage. I like it a lot better in a good one. I do. But I'm the marrying kind. When I was a kid, if you said a guy wasn't the marrying kind, that was code for gay.
Oh.
That hasn't been true for a long time.
Yeah.
I think I've said that to younger folks, and they looked at me like, really? I'd never heard that. That's what it used to be. But I'm the married kind. So my answer is certainly biased by that. I tend to think, no, marriage offers some gifts that you can't get any other way. That you can look at the restrictions of marriage as restrictions. You can look at them as, oh my God, I'm prevented from not just having sex, but prevented from having all sorts of intimate relationships with billions of people, so I can focus on this one person. And that sounds like, oh my God, that's a restriction. Yeah, you can see it that way, but you can also see it as an astonishing gift. It's like there's a level of intimacy you can get in a monogamous marriage, I think, that just is not available any other way. So
Sure.
I'm a fan.
Yeah.
Having said that, I have met many people that clearly don't want that or aren't wired that way.
Yeah.
Those guys I mentioned earlier, those single guys who were saying they keep breaking hearts,
Mm-hmm.
if they were in Saudi Arabia and had enough money, they would have 5 wives
Mm.
and be nice to all of them.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be good monogamous husbands.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, polygamous husbands. But that's not how our culture works. So I don't think it's that we're not wired for it, because so many of us do it.
Yeah.
Not everybody's wired for it. I love to mention Helen Fisher, and she just died within the last year. I think last fall she died.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know who she is? The anthropologist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she wrote all about this. And when she talked about, okay, what do humans do? Are humans monogamous? Are humans non-monogamous? What are we, right? She said, well, studying dozens of cultures, many of them isolated from other cultures for thousands of years, like these way remote places where nobody had been in touch with them for ages,
Sure.
And she studied all these cultures, and she said, if you boil it all together, what we practice as a species is serial monogamy with clandestine adultery. That's what we do. Now, not every individual, I have never cheated on either of the wives I've been married to. Not everybody practices adultery, but lots of us do.
Hmm.
And it is always clandestine. There are very few cultures where it isn't supposed to be hidden. Although there are quite a few cultures, to read Helen Fisher, where they don't make much of a fuss about it. It's like, yeah, everybody knows you're doing it, but just shut up about it.
Hmm.
Don't tell the father of the kids that you're cheating, but he knows. But don't tell him.
Right.
It's clandestine. But the serial monogamy part is very common. That people will tend to stay. Women will tend to stay with the father of their children at least until the kids are pretty well grown.
Yeah.
Usually, not always, not perfectly, but usually that's what we tend to do. So that's, as a species, we seem to have evolved that as kind of our common cultural technique. But that said, I like monogamy. I like it, so I tend to be a fan. So I tend to promote it. I'll tell this to couples I work with. It's a bias. It's not like it has to govern what they do, but I have a bias toward helping them stay together because I feel better that way. Their job is not to make me feel better, but I like it better that way
Hmm.
because I think it's, when a community can do that, and see, that's what I mentioned Braver Angels earlier. When a community can do that, when a community can repair difficult relationships that are important, everybody gets healthier. I'm not saying every marriage has to be saved, but when that happens, or like with Braver Angels, when people can talk across these giant polarized gaps, then things get better.
Hmm.
We work better as a species. We can solve problems more effectively.
Yeah.
We don't have to feel despair. And so to me, again, it's a calling. You know what I mean? That feels there's something sacred about that. It feels like, yeah, that's important to do.
Ultimately, it's letting go of your ego, right? Or the ego.
It's letting go as much of it as you can manage. Yeah, you
Yeah.
need some. I mean, we
Yeah.
all need
Yeah.
to. You need some, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's not letting it be completely governing everything.
Yeah. Bruce, this is a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people, find you? Are you on social media, find your podcast, your books, all of that?
Yep. Easiest place to find all of that stuff about me is just go to my website, brucechalmer.com. So if you go to brucechalmer.com, you'll find information about my practice, about my books, about our podcast has its own website. I mentioned the name of it again, Couples Therapy. I don't know if I did mention it, did I?
No.
Couples Therapy in 7 words. Couples Therapy in 7 words. What are the 7 words, you might ask? I'll tell you. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. 7 words.
Okay.
You have to count and. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. A lot of what I write about, a lot of what we talk about on there sort of elucidates those ideas a bit. That has its own website, CTIN7, CTIN7, Couples Therapy in 7, number 7, CTIN7.com.
Hmm.
But if you go to brucechalmer.com, you get information on all that stuff.
That's great. I'll be sure to add that all to the show notes. I really appreciate you coming on. I really thought this was an insightful conversation. I hope the audience does too.
Thanks for having me on. Much appreciated.
Thank you.